Okay, so I'm Martino Franchi, and I work in the Institute of Physiology of the Department of Biomedical Science at the University of Padova. Today I have the sort of, let's say, infamous task to open this conference. And I'm a little nervous because I was reading about muscle architecture more and more in the past days, and I realized that we don't know so many things. But today, nonetheless, I will try to talk to you about the muscle architecture, what it is, and its functional impact. I will talk about this in theory, and then I will try to see how many evidence we have in vivo the muscle architecture is actually related to muscle function. The spoiler is that right now we don't have many. But anyway, we shall continue. So, my talk plan, who knows me knows that I'm a huge basketball fan. So when I think about talk plan, I always think about the basketball coaches boards. What we're going to talk today is I'll talk about some architecture, muscle architecture fundamentals. Then I will talk about what happens when we see architectural adaptations, when we see them, how, and if they can be influenced by external stimuli like exercise. I will talk a little bit about the muscle architecture and its relation to function in vivo and the evidence that we have in literature. And then I will do some little consideration for the more applied settings. So obviously talking about a muscle architecture in 25 minutes is impossible. So I will be touching really little concepts. Unfortunately, I couldn't put more than this, but let's see if I will be able to give a little bit of a clearer picture. So when we talk about muscle architecture, we talk about the definition of the arrangement of muscle fibers within a muscle, which is relative to the axis of force generation. So Richard Lieber actually defines it as the structural property of whole muscles that dominates their function. Architecture was described with its relation to function for over like 100 years, for over a century. What we see here in this picture is that we have biceps brachii, which is mostly a parallel fibered muscle, so one architectural arrangement. Then we see vastus lateralis, a pinnated arrangement, and the gluteus muscle that has different, let's say, architectural features and a sort of a multipinnate muscle. So what we do have to take to keep in mind is that the architecture is within individual or similar species, and for a given muscle, architecture is actually quite consistent and quite similar. So it's not that the vastus lateralis, my vastus lateralis, will be very, very much different at least in architectural arrangement from someone else. Obviously, the architectural features will change and the anatomical feature will change. But within the same species or individual of the same species, there is a very similarity. And this makes us think that maybe there are certain constraints that can determine muscle architecture. So when we talk about muscle architecture, the features of muscle architecture are basically three. I would say 2 to 3. Fascicle length, pennation angle, fascicle angle, and muscle thickness. Here we see a picture from a Costis Maganaris paper in 2003. It's a gastrocnemius medialis picture and a soleus muscle picture. What you see is that fascicle length is actually the length that runs from, for a fascicle that runs from the deep aponeurosis onto the superficial one of the soleus. The pennation angle is the fascicle angle of insertion of these fascicles into the deep aponeurosis. When we talk about architecture, we talk also about physiological cross-sectional area. So anatomical cross-sectional area would be the result of cutting, let's say, a muscle in perpendicular to the force axis, or perpendicular to the axis, actually not to the force axis, but to the axis of muscle. But physiological cross-sectional area is defined instead as the cross-section that cuts all the fibers at the right angle. So now we do not have to stay a lot on this equation. But what I want you to see is that pennation angle and fascicle length are part of this equation. So they can influence physiological cross-sectional area. And actually, physiological cross-sectional area is a property of a muscle that is related to the maximum force production of the muscles. Here you see an experiment that was made on a Guinea pig muscle. And they estimated from PCSA calculation the maximum tetanic tension, and they put it into relation to the actual measured tetanic tension. And you see that PCSA then is a determinant of maximal force production in muscle. So when we do consider different muscles, as in muscle with different PCSA, and we when consider the major relationships to the force length relationship and the force velocity relationship, in this case, just in the shortening in the shortening velocity portion of the curve. If we consider similar muscle with same fiber length, same pennation angle, same distribution of fiber types and similar output, force output per unit, but we have different PCSA, you see that the relationship, for example, for the length tension relationship, don't change, as in muscle excursion, but what changes is the maximum tension that is produced. As a large PCSA muscle will produce larger tension. Whereas this is seen similarly for the shortening velocity. The shortening velocity will be the same, but the amount of tension that is produced is more in a muscle with large PCSA. And actually, what happens is that if you have instead muscle with similar PCSA, similar pennation angle, but different fiber lengths, this will affect in the length tension relationship the excursion of muscle, and it will affect the long tension relationship, but not the maximum tension that is produced. And this also in the force velocity relationship will affect the velocity of shortening. So what we can find from here, okay, what we can say is that physiological cross-sectional area and is related to the maximum force production, and in theory, fascicle length, fiber length is related to the excursion, muscle excursion, is proportional to muscle excursion, and is related to the changes in maximum shortening velocity. So hope you're all still there, because I know that these concepts are a little boring. I put this slide on to break a little bit the presentation. I can assure you that the presentation from now on will be as boring. So you can keep watching with not much interest if you want. Anyway, just apart, jokes aside, when we talk about muscle plasticity and we talk about skeletal muscle, we cannot basically refrain from talking about its plasticity. Here's a figure from a review by Jeffrey Goldspin in 1985. On the x axis, you will find time, and on the y axis, you will find sarcomeres. Bear in mind, I will not talk about sarcomeres a lot today because for the sake of time, but I want just to show you that what happens is these are mice, so it's working animal. If you immobilize a young muscle, okay, muscle of a young mice in young age, you can see that the sarcomere addition in series is quite impaired, but is somehow, restored when the cast is removed. Then at some point around the 5th week, the mice becomes an adult. And then the sarcomere number in this muscle is a little bit stabilized. What happens is that in an adult muscle, we put a restraint in a lengthened position on a shortened position. We have either addition of sarcomeres in series or loss of sarcomeres in series. And when the cast is removed, this goes back to normality. So you can appreciate that this happens and occurs in a very rapid time, in a very short amount of time. And this makes you appreciate how important is muscle plasticity. And if you think about this in an architecture world, we have here 2 images with the same scale, with the same probe acquired from the vastus lateralis of a young male and from an older male. You can really appreciate that not only the size changes, but also the pennation angle is very different. So this plasticity, you see it also across lifespan. Another way to look into plasticity is unloading. This was a very elegant study from 2007 on unilateral low-link suspension, and 23 days specifically. And when you see that there is a decrease in CSA, tendon stiffness, young modulus of the tendon, and torque, and a very significant one after 23 days, you can appreciate also that resting fascicle length was found to be decreased after 23 days and pronation angle already after 14 days. So muscle do adapt in architecture sense also to different unloading situation. And what about loading? So whenever we do let's say apply a mechanical stimulus on a muscle, we do also see architectural response. This is another, in my opinion, very good studies from a good friend and colleague, Olivier Sénès, and it was done in Manchester when he was back there. And then he showed basically that there's a response of architectural adaptations to flywheel yo-yo exercise, leg extension exercise, already after 10 days of training. So very, very rapid increase in fascicle length, whereas pronation angle reaches significance here after 35 days. But you can appreciate that this architectural adaptation do occur in muscle in a very a short amount of time. And when we talk about increasing fascicle length, usually we think about eccentric exercise. So here I put down, I put in the slide, two videos, one from a concentric action and one from the eccentric action performed on leg press machine. So we could isolate the two phases with taking back the chair, basically in the eccentric action, and letting the load to be lowered. This is the fascicle behavior of the vastus lateralis. What you see here is that when a muscle contracts, the pronation angle increases and there's a shortening of fascicle. Whereas during an eccentric action, what you see happening is that the contraction occurs, the pronation angle stays a little bit the same, and then we have some sort of increase in fascicle length during exercise. So when you apply this mechanical stimulus or these two mechanical stimuli for 10 days, what we showed is that you reach similar degrees of hypertrophy and similar degrees of increase in muscle voluntary contraction. Bear in mind that this exercise was made at the 80% of 1 repetition maximum on leg press on repetition maximum calculated concentrically and eccentrically. What changes though, what seems to be a little bit, that comes up at the eye is that the strategies of different strategies of muscle architecture adaptation were found, where greater fascicle length increase was seen after eccentric training and greater increase in pronation angle after concentric one. And what does this mean actually? So this is a picture that I created in 2017. And I can tell you already that I think that this picture, it can be right, but maybe not completely. And why so? So when we talk about an increase in pronation angle, usually we say that it reflects an increase in sarcomeres in parallel. And this could make sense because the aponeurosis length doesn't really change. And what happens is that you are able to pack more contractile material at a given length. But what, in my opinion, should be, not should be revised, but should be thought about more, is that the increase in fascicle length is reflecting of usually of more addition of sarcomeres in series, as we saw from the animal study that I showed you in casting. The reason of why I say sarcomerogenesis that is happening or not, I don't want to go too much into this, but what I'm saying is we actually don't know. There are like very, there are some, let's say, different results from the animal studies that we have. If you'll ask me, I will say that I do believe that at some point sarcomerogenesis will have to occur, in my opinion. But from what we see in animal studies and actually in human muscles too, from the work from Stanford, Scott Delp and Glenn Litwack, It shows that basically the sarcomere length, it can be different at different muscle sites. So if this is an adaptation of sarcomere's number or sarcomere length, or a mixed of both, this is something that I still don't know. But anyway, this is to be continued as we have some data that will probably come out this year about this. So now we talked about the adaptations, we talked about what muscle architecture is, but we need to understand what architecture means in relation to the function in vivo. So there are not many evidence around. So for example, these are very old evidence, well, not very old, but from 1993 and 2000, from Professor Kawakami and Fukunaga and Professor Abe. And what you see is that fascicle length in this, study was mildly correlated, but significantly so, with sprinters' personal best. And so fascicle length seems to be correlated to some output of performance in this study, or pronation angle here is definitely greater in bodybuilders. So it means that possibly irrelated to force production and hypertrophy. Well, this is a good study that was published in JP by Tony Blazevich's group, that Tony wanted to actually see if there was any relationship between the architectural changes, the architectural adaptation that we were seeing that he was seeing from ultrasound measures, and if this would have been related to changes in muscle angle torque relationship. So here was the concentric training group, and here is the eccentric training group with the isokinetic dynamometer. And what you see is that the angle torque relationship does change. And when you pulled these data together and you pull the data of torque angle changes and fascicle length changes, you can see that fascicle length changes do really follow well the changes in the torque angle shift. So somehow it looks like that probably, or maybe, fascicle length change is related to some function in vivo. However, when Tony went after to study the relationship of the adaptations, and trying to study, actually investigate if the adaptation would have been contraction dependent, he decided to not give as a stimulus concentric or eccentric training, but he decided to give an isometric stimulus at long length and at short muscle length as well. So basically the strain distributed on the fascicle in theory would have been different. And what he saw is that in the short length training, fascicle length increased in the VL, the midside, but without an increase in vastus lateralis volume. Whereas at long length, the training increased in VL proximal site, so different muscle site, with a large increase in volume. But nonetheless, no relationship was found between the angle torque shift and the fascicle length changes. So a little bit going not against, but not finding the same result of a previous study. So why so? I think it's the complex interplay. I think that usually changes in static muscle architecture are measured, and we do not measure what happens usually in the muscle during contraction. We do, but like in these studies of adaptation, we usually try to see if there is an adaptation in architecture and change, and then try to correlate this to function. And usually, as you can see from Tony's work, if he wouldn't have gone and looked at more than a muscle site, he wouldn't have found any increase in fascicle length. So how does this static muscle architecture representative of what is changing in dynamic tasks? Is it only a matter of fascicle length, pronation angle, this interplay, or there's more? What about the extracellular matrix that is inside the muscle? How does this play a role in distributing forces, distributing stresses? What's its role in strains during muscle contraction? And what about the elastic tissue components, the aponeuroses, the serous elastic elements? And what about the muscle gearing and the rotation of muscle fibers during contraction? So we all have to take into account that this is a complex, very complex interplay. And it's about what is inside the muscle, what is at the ends of muscles, what is surrounding other muscles. So I think this is something that I would like to stress quite a lot. That is not only something that is bidimensional, it's not only a bidimensional and biplanar model that we have to look at. So now the last part, excuse me?
5 minutes.
Okay, thanks very much. Right. Okay, I actually have 5 minutes, so I'll go straight. So I told you that I'm able to talk a lot. Who knows me? Yeah, this is one of my weaknesses or strength. Anyway, what I wanted to say is that right now, for you guys that are listening, they listen about muscle architecture. How can I see muscle architecture applied in my applied world? You know, in the sports medicine or physiotherapy world. So usually, we have discussed other muscle. Right now, we are focusing on the biceps femoris long head. You see a very, very nice picture that shows also that fascicles in a 6 centimeter field of view are not clearly seen, all of them. And why is important to see, or why should it be important to see muscle architecture from biceps femoris? Because it gets injured, is a muscle that has a higher injury rate and strain injury rate. And if we can probably make this fascicle longer, you know, this could be having a protective effect. And we know the eccentric exercise does that. So there are studies that show this. However, these studies have been done with a very restricted field of view. What I want to say, and I don't want to go much into this because I've done it already. If we extrapolate fascicle, we really get like different values from what it shows from cadavers. Not different, but let's say very, very long fascicles, I would say. And then we don't know anything about fascicle curvature. We don't know anything about, aponeurosis curvature, and we don't know much about fascicle curvature outside the field of view. So actually, this is usually one knot. It looks like if we see at different muscle sites, and the work of Tony Blažević showed this clearly, that different muscle sites can have different regional potentially adaptations. So I leave you with this video, part of this video, which was courtesy of Neil Cronin and colleagues from Jyväskylä University. So not only we talk about muscle architecture in a static way, right? And there's a problem of extrapolation, but look what happens in the dynamics situation. So during walking, this is biceps femoris long head. And you can see that the deep aponeurosis, the intermediate aponeurosis, goes a little bit in and out of plane with motion. The fascicle do lengthen, do shorten, yes, probably, but there's also torsion there. So how we are able to account this in a specific dynamic task or in a dynamic world? You see, with jogging, this in and out of plane becomes even more consistent, and running, if you see, this is even a little bit more of a mess. So this is definitely not, you know, it's difficult, basically. Before going to the conclusions, one thing that I want to share with you is this video that's courtesy still of Neil Cronin. And this is a gastrocnemius muscle. And what is showing here, I don't know if you can see, it's not really running in my computer. Well, what you should see is that this is a fascicle architecture, basically a measure through by artificial intelligence. So this is maybe something where we should go to in the future. And most of all, guys, what about the third plane, the third dimension? I know that this is something that we cannot do dynamically so far, but we've been talking about bidimensional stuff so far. So my conclusions: muscle architecture in theory can influence function. The architecture adaptations are frequently seen in unloading and loading scenarios. There are not actually many evidence of architecture function relation in vivo yet. And maybe we have had enough of right tools, and we have right now enough of right tools, but so far we haven't used them maybe in the best way. So I think we should do more complex study. What you want, okay, it's indexes. It's very, very quick stuff for you to use, right, in your practice, so on the field or in the sports medicine world. What I do want instead is to provide you with evidence that some of these indexes actually are telling us something. So I will use muscle architecture as a marker of something that is changing, but I will be very careful in always trying to make that leap without further studies. And I'll leave you with this quote. It's one of my favorite. At the end of the day, form follows function. Why does an architecture changes in loading and unloading states? There must be a reason. So far, we need to consider not just two variables, but more than them. So for now, I'm a believer that this means something. Thank you very much. I hope I was not too long and I hope I was clear.